This is a day Aaron Gunches has been asking for more than a decade, even accusing the state of pointless foot dragging. Wednesday, Aaron Gunches was put to death for the murder of Ted Price, Gunches' then-girlfriend's ex. The Price family says they never thought this day would happen.
Today is an incredibly solemn day. It is not taken lightly. It is my job to enforce the law. The death penalty is the law of the land in Arizona.
At 10:33 a.m., inmate Aaron Gunches was put to death by lethal injection, the first execution after the state paused them in 2023. The governor called for a review of the process due to several questionable executions dating back to 2014.
I can say that the process went according to ADCRR policy and procedure. As you'll hear from witnesses today, aside from a cough, Mr. Gunches made no sounds when he was brought into the execution room, and he did not put up any sort of resistance during the process.
Several media members were witness to Wednesday's execution.
Despite the concern about the provenance and the effectiveness and the age of the drugs, I have to say that this is probably the smoothest execution that I've seen.
ABC 15's Ashley Holden, also part of that group, and witnessed Gunches take his last breath.
His eyes closed. Like I said, he had the hard breaths. So I think we were all watching to see what would happen. After that, like I said, I saw some small tremors in his arms. And then it was a pretty quickly loss of conscious.
But Wednesday's death warrant was carried out 23 years after the murder of Ted Price. 23 years he didn't get to spend with his loved ones, including his two kids.
They have spent more than half of their adult lives without their father. Ted never got to walk Brittany down the aisle when she married John. He never witnessed Justin join the Marine Corps or celebrated Justin's marriage to his fiancée, Jamie. Nothing will ever bring Ted back, so we've had no choice but to move forward without him.
At 10:33 a.m. on March 19, 2025, the execution was carried out at Florence State Prison. Witnesses in the viewing area watched as Aaron Brian Gunches was pronounced dead more than 2 decades after the killing that put him on Arizona's death row. What sets this case apart is not only the violence that began it, but the choice the defendant made. He repeatedly asked the courts to carry out his sentence. This moment closed a long legal path and reopened a public debate about punishment and process. How did a dispute over family and custody become a murder, and how did the man convicted of that murder come to insist on his own execution? Why did the state move forward after years of appeals and procedural review? We will lay out the facts precisely, step by step, the people involved, the evidence that linked a traffic stop to a homicide, and the legal decisions that followed. Stay with us, the full picture is more complex than it first appears. If you're still watching, you owe it to yourself and to the truth to subscribe and uncover the rest of this case. Don't miss a single detail. In 2002, Aaron Brian Gunches was 30 years old and living in Arizona. To neighbors, he seemed ordinary, a quiet man who mostly kept to himself. But behind closed doors, tension was building. He was dating a woman who had recently divorced a man named Ted Price, a dedicated father who refused to let his children become strangers. Ted was known among friends as the kind of father who showed up. He followed court orders, made every pickup and drop off on time, and tried to keep his children's lives stable after the divorce. But that same commitment became the trigger for resentment in Gunches. Every phone call, every scheduled visit, every polite exchange between Ted and his ex-wife fueled Gunches' insecurity. Arguments began surfacing around the home, small at first, then louder, more pointed. When Ted's name came up, Gunches' tone shifted. He believed Ted's continued involvement meant interference. Friends later said he often spoke as though Ted's presence was an obstacle that had to be removed, not a father's duty to his children. The pressure inside that household grew heavier by the week. Ted, unaware of what was forming in the background, kept following the custody schedule as he always had. He had no idea that ordinary routines, picking up his kids, making a phone call to confirm plans, were feeding someone else's growing anger. Court documents later revealed that during this period, Gunches began to speak openly about his frustrations. He told at least one acquaintance that Ted needed to stay away for good. It was a statement that would later carry a much darker meaning. This was the start of a pattern: a man consumed by jealousy, unable to accept that his partner's past would always include her children's father. And when jealousy mixes with obsession, reason often disappears. If you've ever seen how simple arguments can spiral into something unthinkable, then you know how quickly control can vanish. Don't look away now. What happens next shows how fast an ordinary life can turn into a headline. Subscribe before we move forward, because the next part of this case exposes how a single decision changed everything. And if you're not sure yet, ask yourself, how does someone go from envy to a crime that shocks an entire state? By late November 2002, tension between Aaron Gunches and Ted Price had reached a breaking point. In the days leading up to it, Aaron had become increasingly irritable, his conversations with friends turning bitter whenever Ted's name surfaced. He told one person that Ted didn't know when to back off, a statement that hinted at what was soon to follow. On the evening of November 21st, Ted was with Aaron's girlfriend, his ex-wife, at her apartment in Mesa, Arizona. Ted had come over to visit his children, a routine arrangement set by the court. But that night, Aaron showed up unexpectedly. Witnesses later recalled that his mood was off, quiet but tense, like a man holding back more than words. Around that time, a neighbor heard raised voices. What started as a tense exchange turned into something much worse. Within minutes, Ted was forced into his own vehicle, a silver sedan he had driven that day. Aaron took the wheel, heading north toward the desert outskirts of Mesa. No one knew where Ted went that night. His family reported him missing soon after, describing him as responsible and predictable, the kind of man who didn't just disappear. But when police found his car abandoned days later along a remote stretch of highway, everything changed. Inside the car, evidence pointed back to Aaron. Fingerprints, fibers, and witness accounts placed him with Ted that evening. It was no longer a missing persons case. It was something much more serious. When police began piecing together the timeline, it became clear Aaron's actions weren't random. He had planned to confront Ted that night, and the confrontation had spiraled beyond control. This moment marked the shift from suspicion to pursuit, from confusion to clarity. Detectives now knew who they were looking for. The only question left was where he had gone. This case shows how quickly jealousy and anger can consume a person until all sense of reason is gone. And if you think this kind of thing only happens in movies, think again, because it happened in a quiet Arizona neighborhood, to an ordinary man just trying to see his kids. Don't scroll away now. Subscribe so you don't miss the next part, where investigators close in on Aaron and uncover what really happened after that drive into the desert. Because if you think you've heard everything so far, the truth that comes next will make you question how well you ever know the people around you. And if you're still watching without subscribing, imagine knowing how this ends but being cut off right before the final reveal. Don't let that happen. Hit subscribe before the truth gets harder to face. In the days following Ted Price's disappearance, Mesa police began to track every lead that pointed toward Aaron Gunches. Witnesses confirmed seeing Aaron driving Ted's car on the night he vanished. What began as quiet speculation turned into a full-blown manhunt. Law enforcement knew that time was working against them. Every hour that passed made their chances of finding Ted alive smaller. Detectives started by retracing Aaron's known movements. He was seen at multiple gas stations and rest stops along U.S. Highway 60. Surveillance footage later confirmed what investigators suspected: Aaron was on the move, heading north toward the Salt River Canyon area. When they finally located Ted's abandoned vehicle, it was found along a remote highway, far from any city lights. Inside, investigators found personal belongings that told a quiet story: Ted never meant to leave. His wallet, phone, and jacket were still there. To detectives, this wasn't a case of someone running away. It was a sign that something had gone terribly wrong. Meanwhile, Aaron had disappeared completely. His phone was switched off, and his known contacts refused to speak openly about where he might be hiding. Police issued a statewide bulletin, describing him as dangerous and unpredictable. But his freedom didn't last long. Roughly a week later, Aaron resurfaced in a rural part of Arizona, near the town of Show Low. Officers received a tip from a local resident who had seen a man matching his description camping near a rest area. The call came in the early hours of the morning. Within hours, officers surrounded the area and moved in cautiously. Aaron was taken into custody without resistance. At the time of his arrest, he appeared calm, detached, almost as if the situation no longer surprised him. Detectives described his demeanor as flat, giving short, quiet answers when questioned. He didn't deny being with Ted that night, but he refused to explain what had happened afterward. Once he was transported back to Maricopa County, Aaron's charges became clear. This was no longer a missing persons case, it was a homicide investigation. Detectives now had the suspect, the evidence, and a clear timeline of what had unfolded that night. But one question still remained unanswered: why had it gone that far? Before we go deeper into what Aaron told investigators and what the forensic results later revealed, take a moment to subscribe. Because this is where the story turns, from a manhunt to a confession that changed everything. And trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. If you've made it this far and haven't subscribed yet, think about it. Stories like this don't just show how dark the world can get, they remind us how quickly normal can turn into chaos. Don't wait until you're the last one to find out what happened next. Hit subscribe now, before the truth gets harder to listen to. And for those who still won't subscribe, explain why in the comments. Because honestly, how could you walk away right before the moment everything comes into focus? After Aaron Gunches was brought into custody, detectives immediately began what would become one of the most critical interrogations in the case. In the stark room of the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, Aaron sat across from investigators, quiet but alert. He didn't appear confused or nervous, only resigned. The silence stretched long enough for detectives to sense that this wasn't a man ready to deny anything. The lead investigator began by laying out the evidence. They had the car. They had the timeline. And most importantly, they had a witness who had seen Aaron and Ted together the night Ted vanished. Aaron didn't argue. When asked why he had taken Ted's car, his answer was simple: I needed to leave. But when detectives pressed further, asking what happened to Ted, Aaron paused. For several seconds, there was nothing but the hum of the fluorescent lights above. Then, with a steady voice, he admitted responsibility. According to his statement, Aaron claimed that things had gotten out of hand. He described a heated argument that escalated quickly. He said he never planned for things to end the way they did, but once it happened, he panicked and drove away. Detectives noted that even as he spoke, Aaron showed no visible remorse, only a detached recounting of events. The confession was direct, leaving little doubt about his role. Detectives carefully documented every word, knowing that this single conversation would shape the case in court. They also discovered that Aaron had a prior criminal history, including a previous violent offense. It painted a picture of a man who had crossed serious lines before, and now, one final act had pushed him beyond redemption. During the questioning, detectives asked Aaron about his motive. Why had he turned on someone who was helping him? He didn't offer a clear answer. Some speculated it was anger, others thought it was fear or a deep sense of instability. Whatever it was, his statement confirmed what investigators already suspected: Ted's fate was sealed the moment he got into that car with Aaron. Once the interrogation concluded, prosecutors moved swiftly. They charged Aaron with first-degree murder and other related offenses. The confession, combined with the forensic evidence, made the case strong. But the public was only beginning to learn about the extent of what had happened. Media outlets in Arizona quickly picked up the story, labeling Aaron as cold and emotionless. As we move into the courtroom phase of this case, where every word and piece of evidence would decide Aaron's fate, take a second to subscribe. Because what happens next, the courtroom moments, the verdict, and what Aaron said before his sentencing, are the kind of moments that stay with you long after you finish watching. If you're the kind of person who believes justice matters, then hit subscribe now. Because the moment you stop watching, the truth stops spreading. Don't be the one who turns away right when accountability begins. And if you still won't subscribe, tell us why in the comments. But ask yourself this: how can you hear about what really happened and not want to know how it all ends? The courtroom phase of Aaron Gunches' case began in early 2008, nearly 5 years after Ted Price's disappearance. By this point, prosecutors had built a strong case, one supported by Aaron's own confession, forensic evidence, and the recovered vehicle that linked him directly to the crime. Inside the courtroom, there was a noticeable stillness each time Aaron was brought in. He spoke little, often responding with short answers. prosecutors outlined the events leading up to Ted's death, presenting timelines, phone records, and witness accounts that tied every piece of evidence together. The prosecution's main argument was clear: Aaron's actions were not the result of panic or confusion. They argued it was deliberate, driven by jealousy and resentment toward Ted's continued role in his ex-wife's life. They pointed to statements Aaron had made before the incident, ones that hinted at hostility and control. Meanwhile, the defense sought to portray him as emotionally unstable, claiming he had acted impulsively and without full awareness. They raised questions about his mental state, trying to persuade the jury that Aaron was not fully conscious of his actions. But despite these arguments, the confession stood firm. Every fact presented circled back to his own words, an admission he never tried to withdraw. During the testimony phase, Ted's family sat quietly through the proceedings. His ex-wife, though visibly shaken, gave a composed account of their shared past and Ted's dedication as a father. Friends described him as dependable, the type of man who always fulfilled his responsibilities without complaint. Each statement reminded the court of what was lost, not through accident, but through choice. When the jury retired to deliberate, the outcome didn't take long. After only a few hours, they returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Aaron showed no outward emotion, staring forward without expression. At sentencing, the judge addressed the courtroom, emphasizing the gravity of Aaron's actions. He noted that Ted Price's death was the result of a conscious and calculated decision. The sentence handed down was death, to be carried out by lethal injection. Aaron listened, nodded once, and was escorted out without a word. The decision brought a measure of closure for Ted's family, but not peace. Outside the courtroom, reporters gathered as Ted's relatives made brief statements, thanking investigators and the court for ensuring accountability. Still, one question lingered: why had Aaron chosen that path when so many chances to stop existed? As Aaron awaited his fate on death row, his case would resurface in later years through appeals and legal challenges, but the original verdict never changed. The state had determined that the crime met every threshold for capital punishment. Before we move forward to the events that happened years later, the appeals, the delays, and the extraordinary twist that would make this case national news again, take a second to subscribe. Because what comes next is the kind of turn you never expect in a case this clear-cut. If you're watching this thinking justice always moves in a straight line, you're about to see how unpredictable it can be. Subscribe now, because this case doesn't end where you think it does. Still not subscribed? Ask yourself, why would you walk away now, right before the truth takes another shocking turn? And if you won't hit subscribe, go to the comments and explain why you'd rather be left in the dark. Because when justice hangs in the balance, silence isn't neutral, it's a choice. Following his sentencing, Aaron Gunches was transferred to the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence, a high-security facility that houses some of the state's most notorious inmates. There, he began what would become nearly 2 decades of appeals, petitions, and unexpected legal turns. Though the verdict was clear, the legal process in capital punishment cases rarely moves quickly. Each motion filed extended his time on death row and reopened old wounds for Ted Price's family. In the early years, Aaron remained largely out of the public eye. His name surfaced only in legal filings and updates from advocacy groups tracking death penalty cases in Arizona. But behind the scenes, he was in constant contact with attorneys, challenging procedural errors and raising constitutional claims. He argued that his representation had been inadequate during the trial and that parts of his confession had been misinterpreted. By 2010, several of his appeals had been denied, but one motion reached the Arizona Supreme Court, forcing a temporary halt in his case. It was procedural, not based on new evidence, but it was enough to slow down any progress toward the execution date. For Ted's family, every new filing felt like reopening the past, a delay in the closure they had been promised. Then, years later, something unexpected happened. In 2022, as Arizona resumed executions after an 8-year hiatus, Aaron's name re-emerged. The state's attorney general at the time sought to move forward with multiple pending death warrants, including his. But the case took a strange turn when Aaron himself wrote to the court, requesting that his execution be carried out. In a letter, he said he was ready to accept the court's judgment. That request immediately caught national attention. News outlets began reporting that an Arizona death row inmate had voluntarily asked for his own execution. But within months, the situation shifted again. When a new state administration came in, they reviewed all pending executions, citing concerns about past procedural issues in the lethal injection process. Aaron's warrant was halted once more. This back and forth reignited a public debate across Arizona. Legal experts argued over whether the justice system had become too slow, while others said the delays reflected the need for accuracy in capital cases. Through it all, Ted Price's family continued to wait years turning into decades. By 2024, the state still had not set a new date. What was once considered settled justice had now become a symbol of uncertainty in Arizona's execution process. For some, that uncertainty meant fairness. For others, it meant that justice had stalled. When reporters revisited the case, Aaron's early words during his confession still echoed, calm, without emotion, as though he had long accepted his fate. But the system he was in seemed unwilling or unable to bring that fate to its end. It's a haunting reality. The justice system promises finality, yet years later, the case remains in limbo. The man who confessed to ending a father's life still waits in a cell, while the family of that father waits for a conclusion that seems endlessly postponed. Before we move forward to what happened most recently, the political battles, the renewed scrutiny of Arizona's death chamber, and what Aaron's case revealed about the flaws in the system, take a moment to subscribe. Because this isn't just a story about one man, it's about how justice can lose its way. If you think justice should never stall this long, hit subscribe right now. If you don't, you're choosing silence in the face of a broken system. Still not sure? Imagine being Ted Price's family 20 years later, still waiting. Could you stand by without answers? If not, subscribe. Stay informed. Don't be part of the crowd that forgets the victims when time moves on. And if you won't subscribe, go to the comments and explain why you'd rather look away while justice fades into delay. After nearly 2 decades of legal back and forth, public debate, and procedural halts, the case of Aaron Brian Gunches stands today as one of Arizona's most complex and unsettling reminders of how justice can evolve or unravel over time. Aaron remains on death row. Despite his own written request to have his sentence carried out, no execution date has been set. The process has been frozen in a cycle of legal reviews, administrative hesitations, and shifting political priorities. Each new attorney general, each new policy review, brings with it a fresh delay, and for the victim's family, another wave of emotional exhaustion. For the family of Ted Price, the wait has been agonizing. In every hearing, every court filing, they've been forced to relive the details of a night that shattered their world. What was meant to be the end of one tragedy has instead become a slow-moving loop, one that never seems to reach its conclusion. But this case is more than just a legal record. It reveals something deeper about the justice system, its power, its flaws, and the heavy burden it places on both sides of the courtroom. The lesson isn't only about guilt or punishment. It's about time, how it changes perception, how it tests the limits of justice, and how it leaves families suspended between closure and uncertainty. In this case, time has blurred the line between justice served and justice denied. Even within the prison system, Aaron's case drew quiet attention. His decision to ask for his own execution, followed by years of silence, created a psychological paradox. Was it remorse, resignation, or the weariness of a man who no longer believed the system would act? The courts never fully answered that question. But what they revealed instead was how a single case could expose deep cracks in the way the death penalty is carried out. Legal experts have since pointed to this case in debates about reform. They've asked why so many death sentences remain unresolved, and whether a justice system that moves this slowly can truly claim to deliver justice at all. And yet, for all the procedures, filings, and opinions, the human cost remains the same. A man lost his life. A family lost their peace. And the person responsible still lives in suspended accountability. If you're watching this right now, ask yourself, what does justice mean when it never ends? Is it punishment, closure, or simply the recognition that what was done can never be undone? Because one of the hardest truths of this case is that no sentence, no execution, and no verdict can restore what was taken. But a system that delays justice risks taking something else, public trust. The Aaron Gunches case remains open-ended, and as of now, there's no certainty about when or if Arizona will carry out his sentence. But the lessons are undeniable. Justice delayed is justice distorted. When years pass without resolution, victims' families suffer a second kind of pain, the pain of waiting in vain. Systems must evolve. Legal safeguards are vital, but when they become entangled in politics or bureaucracy, they lose the very purpose they were built for: truth, accountability, and closure. Every decision made by a state, a court, or an individual inside a prison cell ripples outward, affecting families, communities, and the moral fabric of society itself. As viewers, we're left to consider what we believe justice should look like: swift and certain, or cautious and humane. But one thing is clear: indifference is not an option. So, before this documentary ends, ask yourself one more time, what would you do if justice for your loved one was put on hold for 20 years? Would you stay silent, or would you demand answers? If your answer is the latter, then don't scroll past this. Subscribe now. Because every voice added to this platform amplifies stories that deserve to be remembered, not buried under red tape. And if you won't subscribe, at least tell us why in the comments. Why would anyone choose silence in the face of a case that defines the limits of human patience and the fragility of justice itself? This isn't just a documentary, it's a record of how time tests truth, how law meets morality, and how one case in Arizona continues to ask the question the world still hasn't answered: when does justice truly end?